David Seymour introduced the Treaty Principles Bill into Parliament yesterday, and so this is the quickest breakdown I can possibly do about why that's bad for anybody that doesn't have time to look into it. As a starting point, the Treaty Principles are already cooked. There's two ways that laws are made, one's through Parliament and the other one is through the courts. And the Treaty Principles are something that has come up through the courts. And this is because when the treaty was signed in 1840, there were two versions, one in Māori and the other in English. And the English and Māori version of the treaty don't match up, and that's one of the biggest issues with the Treaty of Waitangi. But a really key thing to remember is that the majority of Māori rangatira signed the Māori version. And absolutely nowhere in the Māori version does it say, we cede sovereignty. So all the arguments about Māori ceding sovereignty and the Queen having supreme power and all that kind of stuff come from the English version. But the reason we're not allowed to rely on that as a total kind of be-all and end-all is because most of the Māori signed the Māori version. One of the most important parts in the Māori version is that Māori were guaranteed tino rangatiratanga over their homes, over their lands and over their possessions or taonga. The rangatira of the time would have gone, well of course, like no doubt about that, but tino rangatiratanga would have been the closest possible word to sovereignty. And the word tino rangatiratanga has been studied for decades now, but what does tino rangatiratanga actually mean? And it's more than sovereignty, and it's a really special Māori concept about having self-determination, autonomy, mana motuhake, and sovereignty over yourself. And this guarantee of tino rangatiratanga under the Māori version of the Treaty of Waitangi is where a lot of the legal arguments of today stem from about what rights Māori should have under the treaty. And just as an example of this, if Māori were guaranteed tino rangatiratanga over their own homes under the Treaty of Waitangi, in what world did the Crown have the right to come into those homes and take Māori babies out of them? The answer is that they didn't have the right, they breached the treaty, and they did it in a way that caused harm for a lot of Māori whānau that have ended up perpetuating cycles of violence ever since that breach of the treaty. In the English version of the treaty, the tino rangatiratanga part is defined as undisturbed possession of lands and forests and stuff. And that is just so wrong when you understand the cultural context behind the word or the phrase tino rangatiratanga. There's no way they match up in any way. And just to remember that most of those rangatira only signed the version where they were guaranteed tino rangatiratanga, not undisturbed possession. So tino rangatiratanga was the closest possible word to sovereignty, but the Crown knew that Māori were never going to cede tino rangatiratanga, so they made up a word for sovereignty. And that word is kāwanatanga, which derives from the word kāwana, which means governor, because there were governors coming over from Britain. So the Māori version of the treaty says that the rangatira cede kāwanatanga to the Queen of England, which wasn't a word in the Māori vocabulary back then. So they would have gone, okay, you can have your kāwanatanga as long as I've got my tino rangatiratanga, that's sweet as. But this fundamental difference in meaning is the reason that we have the treaty principles. Because the Crown's going, hey, I've got full sovereignty, I can do whatever I want. And the Māori are going, no, you guaranteed me tino rangatiratanga and you've stomped all over that. And actually honouring the treaty and upholding the treaty would mean recognising tino rangatiratanga to its full extent, which is something that the Crown is just not prepared to do. So the courts have had to look at both versions of the treaty and go, guess we've got to find a middle ground. And this middle ground that the court found is not controversial at all, or it shouldn't be if you're a fair and reasonable person. Like one of the principles is partnership. The Crown's supposed to work in partnership with Māori, because Māori have granted them the right to govern over Aotearoa, over New Zealand. Another one is protection. The Crown has a duty to protect Māori from the things that they brought over. And another one is good faith. The Crown has to work in good faith with Māori. Is that so hard? But it is so hard because the Crown would like to pretend that Māori ceded sovereignty and they have no specific guaranteed rights under the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a lie that someone like David Seymour is able to push so hard because most people don't understand the history and the context in which the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, and they don't want to teach it in schools, although we are going to get it in schools. But that's why we're at this point where they're able to push this kind of lie and twist things and manipulate things, because most people don't have the time, like me, to sit around and read articles about the history and the context behind the Treaty of Waitangi and the difference in the translations, and this is all academic stuff that most people don't have the time to sit around and bother with. And that's exactly why I'm making this video. But the key part about David Seymour's bill that I actually want to talk about, or just explain with that context behind it, is that he's trying to redefine tino rangatiratanga. His new bill redefines the second article of the treaty to say that everyone in New Zealand gets tino rangatiratanga. And you might think, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. But the issue with that is that it takes tino rangatiratanga out of its cultural context and makes it pretty much null and void. Everyone has human rights. Everyone has property rights. Everyone has the right not to be assaulted. But not everyone was guaranteed tino rangatiratanga under the Treaty of Waitangi. And this is one of the big issues with the bill, is that David Seymour is trying to say tino rangatiratanga applies to everyone, which basically means it applies to no one. So there's 3 readings in Parliament and it has to pass all 3 before it actually becomes law. And National and New Zealand First have said they're not going to support the bill past the first reading, which means the ACT Party won't have enough support to actually make this bill law. But we're not praising National or New Zealand First for that, because that's less than the bare minimum. This bill should never have been given money to be drafted. ACT was the party that yapped on about trying to save the country money, and National's supposed to be the big economy saver, and here they are wasting money on a bill that they've already said they're not going to pass, and also is stupid. It's objectively a stupid bill. But one silver lining I am hoping comes from this bill is, first of all, the toi tūtiriti hikoi is going to be unreal. And then secondly, hopefully more people will look into the historical context and the cultural context behind the Treaty of Waitangi as a result of this bill, which would be really cool, because having more people that actually understand the treaty is always going to help. So, silver lining.
The New Zealand Parliament has no legitimacy, no legal validity without Te Tiriti o Waitangi. The Parliament depends on Te Tiriti for its existence. Technically, any Parliament which violates Te Tiriti o Waitangi is illegal. And so the Parliament, something that is inferior to Te Tiriti, cannot simply create a law or pass a bill or act which would make Te Tiriti o Waitangi redundant. The reason for this is because of a document that a lot of New Zealanders ignore. A document which precedes Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and which in many ways even surpasses it. And that is He Whakaputanga o Te Rangatiratanga o Nutireni, our own Declaration of Independence, if you will. In 1835, numerous Northern Maori rangatira came together to sign a document which would essentially allow their sovereignty to be recognised internationally, more specifically at the time by the various European empires. The declaration declared that all sovereign power in this country would reside within the heads of the tribes of New Zealand. It also said that no government could ever be established or make laws in New Zealand without the approval of those sovereign chiefs. The word in the declaration, which was written in Māori, that is translated as government, is kawanatanga. You might see where I'm going with this. The declaration was sent off to Britain and was acknowledged by King William IV and the British government. Now this is important because according to international law at the time, and now, no state is able to assume authority over another sovereign state without that state's approval. So it meant that the British Empire, the French Empire, whatever, couldn't come to New Zealand and presume sovereignty over these islands, unless the sovereign power already here agreed to give it up. Now that's something that never happened, but that's another conversation from where I'm trying to go here. Now, 5 years later, those chiefs, who were the leaders of this new nation state, agreed to allow the British Empire to establish a government here in New Zealand in order to govern the Pākehā, the British people who were settling here. Because as He Whakaputanga says, those chiefs were allowed to appoint whichever legislative authority, whichever kawanatanga they wanted. And so they chose that for the British residents, they would allow the British to establish a government for those residents. Specifically, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, signed in 1840, gave Queen Victoria and her successors the power of kawanatanga, the same word used in He Whakaputanga to refer to a legislative body assigned by the sovereign chiefs to enact their laws. And so basically a sovereign nation state created in 1835 and recognised by the British Empire and by international law allowed the British Empire to establish a government here for its subjects. That same government has no right to then just erase the document that allows it to exist here in the first place. Any government, any kawanatanga in New Zealand needs the proper approval of those sovereign chiefs. That approval was granted to the Parliament in 1840 by Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Now with all that going on, right, Let's see how the Asians will be affected.
Equal rights for all. Act's Treaty Principles Bill would confirm in law that all New Zealanders have equal rights. That's great, right? All Asian Aotearoans want is to be included equally in their own country. No. The Treaty Principles Bill is using this equality language to distract from the fact that all it will do is entrench European dominance, not move towards true multiculturalism. Why? Because by removing the idea that Māori have indigenous sovereignty over this land, which is what the bill does, who are we as New Zealanders? It'll be what it has been, a land of British culture that speaks English, and although we have Chinese restaurants and a Diwali festival and say the word kumara and whānau from time to time, our default is still mainly English. Don't get tricked when they say they want multiculturalism. If they manage to unindigenize Māori people, they will continue to turn their noses up at you if your English isn't perfect, or if your lunch smells weird compared to their sandwiches. This will continue. But if we support tino rangatiratanga, the idea of indigenous sovereignty over this land, then we tell European people that they come from a migrant background as well, just like us. And that is the first step to actual multiculturalism.
Why is there a hikoi? Because I don't know, and I don't know anyone that...
Understandable, bro. If I wasn't a lawyer, I wouldn't know how to explain it. And honestly, if I wasn't a lawyer, I don't even know if I'd care. But David Seymour relies on people not knowing and not caring, so I'm going to do my best elevator pitch on this topic. There's two versions of the treaty, one in Māori and one in English. Most of the Māori chiefs at the time signed the Māori version, and the British Crown, who was like the royal family and was Queen Victoria at the time, went by the English version. The English version pretty much says the Māori chiefs give Queen Victoria all the power, but you can keep your little stuffs and you get the rights of British citizens. The Māori version says Queen Victoria gets the right to govern, but Māori get to keep tino rangatiratanga, which is really important. What the heck does tino rangatiratanga mean has been studied by people way nerdier than me for decades. And pretty much it's a really special Māori cultural concept that's kind of like having self-determination or mana over yourself. Then after the treaty, basically the Crown stomped on both versions, confiscated land, banned te reo in schools, imprisoned Māori chiefs for not selling land, that kind of stuff. Then ages later, the Waitangi Tribunal gets set up because the Crown recognises they stomped on both versions of the treaty and they need to at least apologise for it or try to fix some stuff. So the Waitangi Tribunal's looking into all this horrible stuff that the Crown's done, and they're looking at the two versions of the treaty and going, these don't even match up. So they go, okay, let's look at both versions, find a middle ground and call these the principles of the treaty. And these principles are like partnership, protection, good faith. There shouldn't even be a drama over them. The main thing to remember is that these principles have been painstakingly argued over by lawyers, judges, historians, tribunal members, experts in the field. And if David Seymour is an expert on the treaty principles, then I'm an expert on the Warriors Rugby League team championship history. And what David Seymour's trying to say is that tino rangatiratanga is not a cultural concept, it applies to everyone, and pretty much it just means live your best life. Everyone can do it. But he knows that if he makes tino rangatiratanga apply to everyone, then Māori have no arguments to say they want to do things in a Māori way, because there's no right to. But he knows that that's really hard to understand if you don't have this big academic background knowledge of the Treaty of Waitangi, and he's relying on that. So when he goes, just let us vote on it, just let us do a public vote on whether or not the treaty principles should be clarified, he knows that most people do not have the time to go and actually understand the history of the Treaty of Waitangi. And every time I hear David Seymour or one of his supporters say, okay, just let us vote on it then, let us take a public vote on the treaty principles, my answer to that would be, okay, let me vote on a capital gains tax then. And do you know what they would turn around and say? No, we can't have a public vote on a capital gains tax because not everybody's a tax expert. And David Seymour and his filthy rich supporters would be screaming, crying and throwing up before they ever let a public vote happen on a capital gains tax. But when it's a Māori issue, it's all good. It doesn't matter that nobody's experts and people don't have the time to look into it. It's all good. Let everyone vote. But yeah, sorry. Hope that was short enough and hope it was helpful.